Good morning, afternoon, evening. If you've been watching this, this is the Unit 3 note. So I'm going to record these again. I don't know if you're watching or not, but we'll see what happens. So when we talk about Unit 3, we're going to focus on food chains, food webs, and trophic levels, how they link species. And so this should be a review from biology, but what we need to know is that when ecosystems, some consumers feed on a single species, but most have multiple food sources. And in this way, an individual food chain can actually become a food web. And actually, food webs are much more better representation of what's occurring out in the environment. And so when we talk about these different levels, we need to talk about a trophic level. And essentially, what a trophic level is, it's just an organism's feeding status. And so herbivores are your primary consumer or plant eaters, and then carnivores are secondary consumers or flesh eaters, and then you can move on to like primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. Most do not get above quaternary, above 4 levels because of this loss of energy. Another important part of this whole trophic level idea is decomposers. And what decomposers do, they're the ones that kind of return the materials back into the ecosystem. So such things as scavengers like crows, jackals, and vultures will clean up a dead carcass. Detrivores like ants and beetles will consume litter, debris, and dung, so stuff that may have already been processed. And then fungi and bacteria, they complete the final breakdown. So when we look at trophic levels, we got to talk about these things. We got to look at these ecological pyramids. And so what an ecological pyramid does, it describes essentially the trophic level. So here we see an ecological pyramid. It's showing the amount of available energy or a percentage of material. So producers, have 100% due to photosynthesis. We go to herbivores, primary and the top carnivores. And so as you can see, as we move up each level, we lose a percentage of available energy or material. So all species will have to live within limits within these trophic levels, and so there are environmental factors that exert selection pressures, and so for this reason, species are limited. And each environmental factor has both a minimum and a maximum, and we call this a tolerance limit. And any organism that is outside of that tolerance limit will not survive. So example, there are certain freezing temperatures in the northern range for the saguaro cactus, excuse me. And so that cactus lives in a range, right? Tolerance range. And if it goes to either extreme, may cause the organism to die. So this is called a range of tolerance curve, which we'll be doing one of these in class. We'll be graphing some data about, I think it's trout. But as you can see on either end of the zone of intolerance, which is you're not going to survive, you have zone of physiological stress, and then you have your optimal range. And so as you go from left to right, you see how those extreme ranges can lead to species being absent. So when we talk about tolerance, we also need to talk about this thing called a niche. And a niche is essentially the organism's role in the environment. And when we talk about niche, we have to talk about habitat. So a habitat describes the place or the environmental conditions. So for example, that leopard there, its habitat, right, would be in the savanna of Africa. Actually kind of likes hanging out in the trees too. But the ecological niche is the role that species plays in that community, whether it is a detrivore, carnivore, producer. And so the niche is defined by several factors, one of these being its tolerance. And so when we talk about niches, we talk about generalists and specialists. Generalists tend to be organisms that have very broad niches, so like cockroaches. They can survive pretty much any kind of change in the environment, where a specialist tends to have a narrow niche. So for example, this giant panda. This giant panda can only live in a specific area because it only feeds on a specific type of food. So that would be a specialist. So go ahead, maybe pause the video and jot down some specialists you can think of. When we talk about how organisms survive in an environment, we also have to talk about this competitive exclusion principle. And so basically, no two organisms can occupy the same ecological niche for too long because they're going to outcompete each other. So one organism is going to be better suited for its environment, and so that organism will be able to survive better and leads to exclusion of the other. And what we call this process of niche evolution is resource partitioning. So one organism is better able to partition materials than the other. So here are warblers partitioning the resource to reduce competition. And as you can see, we've got a Cape May warbler, which tends to feed up at the top. It may overlap the Blackberryan warbler and then the black-throated green warbler. So you can see where there is some overlap of some of these niches, and then as we move down, the yellow-rumped warbler kind of hangs out in the bottom. And so if you look at 60-foot, 40, 20, 10, you can see how they've reduced competition. And so here's some models of competitive exclusion principle and resource partitioning. So there's our abundance, there's our resource gradient, there's competition, and there's your niche breadth. So it tends to be where that competition, right, one's gonna outcompete the other. If we look at the right, there's your resource gradient, and you have divergence. So what that divergence means that red and the blues got narrowed. And so by reducing this competition here, they're going to be better suited for survival. And so I don't know why this geographic isolation, that should not be in there, but what geographic isolation does, I kind of removed all of the speciation stuff, but that can show you how resource partitioning and competitive exclusion principle can lead to evolution of new species. Well, I guess I can leave it there. All right, let's talk about species interaction, how they shape communities. So competition leads to resource allocation, which we talked about, and competition among members of the same species. So two lions fighting over the same resource, that would be intraspecific. Competition between members of different species is called interspecific. So you've got intra and inter. And so when we're talking about how different organisms interact, we have to talk about predation. And you may only think of carnivores like the lion or the cheetah or the leopard on the Serengeti, but actually a predator is any organism that feeds directly on another. So herbivores, carnivores, omnivores were all predators. We're considered a predator, right? I think if we looked around the room, not many of you would survive if you had to go out and kill your own food. Right, especially if they put the faces of the cows that you're eating when you have a steak or a burger, I can't imagine some of you would still do it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but so predation is it's powerful but complex influence on species. And so herbivory is a type of predation. So caterpillar eating a plant, that's a predation. However, some adaptations have evolved to avoid predation. So, for example, toxic chemicals, body armor, extraordinary speed, ability to hide. These are just some few strategies organisms use to protect themselves. And so, as we're talking about predation and an organism's role in an ecosystem, we need to talk about a keystone species. So, a keystone species plays a critical role in a community because they exert their influence by changing the competitive relationship. And so, they help, got a little accent there. They help maintain balance in ecosystem. We're going to talk more about keystone species, but these cute little otters, they're a keystone species, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So let's talk about how growth occurs. So when we're talking about these species, and if there's uncontrolled growth, growth can lead to population. If populations grow too fast, can lead to issues. So growth without limit is exponential. We call that a J curve. And so we got biotic potential is the amount of potential growth of a population with unrestrained reproduction. They're just producing without any constraints. So exponential growth is R, it's a population growth, that's your J curve, and a logistic growth, that's your carrying capacity, that's your S curve. So there's a J curve right there in red, and there's a thing called overshoot where if an organism gets beyond carrying capacity, you have overshoot and you have dieback. So for whatever reason, there's not enough resources in the environment to support them. So population cycles between predator and prey often will resemble different types of graphs. And so here we have snowshoe hare and a lynx. And so as you can see, as the snowshoe hare increases, the lynx increases. But then if you get too many lynx, they eat too many of the hare and they drop. So we'll look more at these population cycles later on. S curve is logistic. This is when a population does adhere to carrying capacity. And so these look like wolves. And as you can see, their carrying capacity is the amount that the environment can sustain. So what limits population size? We got density dependent and density independent factors. So density dependent basically means that the population size controls how big the population grows. So with a larger population, increased risk of disease or parasites will spread, and so or even predators. So anything that the population impacts is density dependent. A density independent is something that limits the population but it's non-biological. So active nature, earthquakes, tsunami, those kind of things. And so species respond to limits differently. So you've got an R and K. So R selected, they're very short lifespans, rapid growth. So think of insects. K selected are you. So R selected are things that are going to produce a lot of offspring that don't survive, but K selected are basically humans, and we'll talk more about that. And then these are also these survivorship curves, which we'll talk about how these survivorship curves interact. And for me to try to do a survivorship curve here via the video would not be the best, so we'll save this one for class. And so, but organisms with different life histories produce different survivorship curves, right? And so if we look at elephants, they're going to have a different survivorship curve because they live to old age, as opposed to a gull, as opposed to, I think that's a Ginsbach. No, onyx. Okay, I don't remember what C is. High infant mortality rate and long adult lifespan. So if you go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. So the elephant represents A, right? They have a long survival, whereas D plants, if they make it, they'll survive, but they're going to produce a lot of offspring, but they may not survive. So, all right, I tried to keep it under 10 minutes. I got right to 10 minutes. So again, this is just for you to watch on your own if you choose to. This will be Unit 3, and I hope you found this helpful. So this is me signing off from room 102, beautiful in Tiffin's beautiful South Side. I will see you in another video.